everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name's Sarah Davis. I'm the studio manager here at Phoenix. We run these events every 6 to 8 weeks, giving our studio members the opportunity to talk about their work. And we're really thrilled that we have these guys here tonight. We've got 4 artists from, and I'm going to try and remember, so Anna, you're from Denmark, and Inga Bjork, you're from Iceland. Iris is from Germany. Ish. And Mike is from Plymouth. So they've been working here at Phoenix for the last few weeks on a project that we're going to hear all about tonight. Just to let you know, if I'm sure all of you know that Phoenix, we're a charity here. We house 100 odd studios upstairs. We have an affordable kind of studio space for artists. We also have a public events programme, which is the gallery in the main gallery, but also we have a very good education programme. So if you haven't engaged with us, please do. So I'm going to hand you over to Joseph, who's going to host tonight's evening. And I think that's all I'm going to say. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, welcome. So welcome. The Landscape Islands project is an initiative of myself and Kay Aplin. I work in sound. I'm a sound artist. I make installations and I work for galleries and museums. And Kay is a public artist working in ceramics, whose practice has moved more into sort of gallery work and private commissions over the last few years. And we started working together a few years ago, collaborating on a few small projects, just looking at the possibilities and the similarities between ceramics and sound as practices. So they're seemingly very, very diverse things. This idea of kind of marriage of craft and digital, if you like. The first thing that we did was, Kay is the curator and the founder of the Ceramic House, which is an art project which he can tell you a bit more about, which is we open during the Brighton Festival every year as part of Artists Open Houses, and the whole house is basically an artwork. There's basically every single surface that can be tiled has been tiled. So it's tiled inside and out, and it's a kind of ceramic fantasy land, and it's full of texture and colour. And in the first year that we opened in 2011, I got a commission from the House Festival to make a kind of audio guide to go with the first ever exhibition at the Ceramic House. And that piece was called Bass Sound Sonic Gold. And the idea behind it was kind of alchemy. It was because at that time I knew nothing basically about the ceramic practice. I've kind of obviously learned and assimilated things over the last few years. But what impressed me initially was this idea of a piece of clay going into a kiln, and then, it's kind of a piece of raw earth, if you like, and then coming out, and there's an alchemical process which turns it into something of worth, something of value. And I saw an analogy of that with how I work with sound, in that I go out and I collect raw field recordings, I process, I work with those sounds and hopefully turn them into something of value. There are just the kind of sounds, if you like, that are normally disregarded perhaps, or that we ignore on a daily basis, just everyday noises. But I'm interested in those kind of everyday sounds and what they signify. And that's what my work sort of starts with. That's my bass sound, and then hopefully Sonic Gold comes out the other end. So that was the first time we worked together, and we've kind of collaborated a couple of times since. Fast forward a little bit to last year. We, obviously quite a while in the planning, but Kay had been doing some work up in the Shetland Islands on a public art commission. Previously, what was that, 2010? 2010. And I had an idea about wanting to go back there and wanting to go and make some more work there. And this idea evolved over time, and eventually what we did was we set up a joint residency so that the two of us could go and spend a month in Shetland at Scalloway Booth, and then we organised an exhibition at Shetland Museum and Archives. And yeah, I'll let you take it from that point about the sort of residency process and how
I'll stand up because I can't see some
Yeah.
of you.
I'll go through some pictures.
So Scalloway Booth is a lovely little place. There it is. So that was where we lived and worked for a month. It's pretty small, and it's got a studio underneath which is more set up for painters and sculptors. It's a kind of dirtier workspace. But because the way we spent the residency was basically going for walks every day, so we had a month, and every single day we went for a walk in a different place in Shetland, and we met up with Shetland Amenity Trust to map out some good routes. And when we went for these walks, we were both collecting things. I was collecting plants, and as you can see, there are hardly any trees at all on Shetland because it's so windy. So I was collecting very small plants that were almost, don't really notice them, they're growing underfoot. And I used a digital microscope to blow them up and turn them into the ceramic. Yeah, here's the digital microscope I used, so you can see how small that is. And then I printed all these images off and eventually used those as the base for the ceramics that I made. And Joseph was collecting sounds, recording the sounds of Shetland while we went for these walks. And the great thing, I learned a lot about sound as well, and the fact that it's rare to find a place where there is no noise pollution of human interaction. So Shetland really, there tends to be, maybe one road going through each of the islands, and then some, branches off that. But it's very, very easy to get to somewhere where there is absolutely no cars anywhere nearby, no planes overhead. And so Joseph managed to get some really great sounds. And then that's what we did for the whole month that we were up there. We just gathered.
Interviewing machine, yeah.
So we went to, it was summertime. We picked the summer because I needed plants to be growing. And in fact, I really noticed that going back in April for the exhibition, nothing had started growing by then. We could never have done that residency in April. Yeah. It was totally lush with plants everywhere, but even though they were very small. And there were all these great things going on, like a lot of the different towns in Shetland have a fair, or they hold them a show actually. So this was one of them. The Walls show. Yeah. And so he got some great animal noises there, sheepdog trials, things like that.
Yeah. So eventually, what we then did was we then took all this work away, came back to our studios here, and then started to make the piece of work that became In a Shetland Landscape. The title itself is taken from, it's a reference to a John Cage piano piece from 1948 called In a Landscape. And what I was really interested in with this is that the experience that we had being in the landscape is different from kind of the representation of landscape that one tends to think of when one thinks of landscape painting in particular, which is more of a kind of, you're viewing something at a distance. It's more of an objective viewpoint. What we were interested in was the immersion of feeling part of the landscape when you're actually out there walking in it. And we wanted to try and find a way to use our respective practices to combine in the gallery space to kind of create that feeling of immersion in some way. So as you say, what you did was to magnify these tiny plants to larger than life size so that you've got something to really focus on visually. And then the sound was a 4-channel sound system in the gallery space, which then offered this kind of layered, quite a sort of poetic sort of version of just the ordinary everyday sounds organized into kind of 4 separate distinct movements of birds and sea, wind and rain, humans and animal noises, and then returning, as like you do in the kind of sonata format in classical music, returning back to the wind, to the sea and the birds at the beginning. And so this is just a few pictures of the actual kind of piece itself up in Shetland. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that this is the first part of what it became the Landscape Islands project. So out of this, we then had the idea to extend the project to other ceramic and sound artists working together in various different ways. And the residency was a big part of that, but I'll come on to that. The first bit that we did was actually in May at the Ceramic House, and Kay curated a ceramics-focused exhibition with artists that make work about landscape and all live on islands of various different sizes. And then we had some accompanying sound art performances. Do you want to just say a little bit about the exhibition?
Yes, so it was quite a challenge to find the artists this year for the exhibition, because it was quite a specific theme. So they had to live on an island or come from an island, and their work had to be about the landscape of the island. So so here we have Shetland and Orkney, actually. So the middle row is John Jacob from Shetland, and he's got a pottery up there. So these are obviously quite traditional potters here. Andrew Appleby, this is work below and at the top shelf. He's actually an archaeologist and a geologist and an author now, as well as a potter. He's been a potter for about 35 years. And his work is all about the Neolithic archaeology of Orkney. So Orkney is obviously really famous for its archaeological digs. And so that's what's represented in his pottery. And then we had Delphine Emmanuel from Sardinia. So her work is all about the coastal life of Sardinia, as you can see. She's based in London now. Owen Quinlan from Ireland. So he goes beachcombing a lot. He lives in Galway, and he's very interested in volcanic glazes. Well, that's what all these glazes are, which really they do look like they're erupting on the surface of the pots and the sculptures that he makes. So he and Paul Scott. That's okay. We'll probably come back to another picture of Owen's anyway. So Paul Scott's a very well-known ceramic artist in Cumbria. So I had to get my head around, can I include the British Isles? Of course I can. And so his work is all about the political landscape, really. But it's also very much about landscape, as you can see as well.
And that's all the...
Oh, right. Well, then we had...
a quick Gracie.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just going on to describing all the different artists. And then we had... Charlotte, an artist from Bornholm in Denmark. Ingeborg was also invited. Her work is all about the geology of Iceland. And Anne-Marie Jacobs, her work is all about salt marshes in Essex, and she lives on Mersey Island there. I might have forgotten someone, it doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah. Okay. And then we accompanied that with some performances. So one of the things I did was that's an instrument called a sonic baton, which is a custom designed controller for sound. I can literally conduct noise with it. It's something that Mike Blow here built for me a few years ago for another project, and I've been using it as a performance tool ever since. And it's a nice way of being able to add a kind of visual element to sound projection. I think I got fed up of going to sound art gigs and performances where people were just kind of hunched behind a laptop and they might as well just been, writing an email or something. There's not much to look at, to really focus. And what I found with this is that actually there's a kind of visual language that goes with it that actually helps the listening process as well. So we did that, and we had some performances by local sound art and music improv duo called Brambling. Paul Camasio Morgan. Paul does the All Guitaritis concert series, which you may have seen here in the past. They do a regular night over at the Caroline of Brunswick. And Paul helped me to put together some of the sound program for this. And that is Steve Beresford. He's a sort of legendary improviser from London, and his current collaborator, Blanca Regina, playing with lots of different objects and things in the gallery space. And then moving to do some more sort of improv stuff in the living room space, and so you can see accompanied by video things as well. One thing we haven't talked about here actually is the new gallery space at the house in camera.
Yeah, so if you just go back so we can see it there. So I've been having, obviously as Joseph described, the house is very colourful because it's got tiled surfaces everywhere, but it's very colourful anyway, and there's a lot of stuff, and when there's an exhibition on, sometimes it's quite difficult to show the work, certain things, and particularly installation pieces. And so we decided to convert the garage into a white cube, a very small one, and focus on sound and ceramics and installation as well. So we're now calling it the world's only sound and ceramics gallery, maybe. And can I just say one more thing about your Sonic Baton performances in May? So as Joseph said, we had these two duos doing sound baton performances on different nights. And on the opening night we had performances as well. And we had about 100 people at the opening, and everyone, obviously impossible to get everyone into this is what used to be the garage, which is a very small space. And so for the following two performance nights, Joseph did his Sonic Baton performances outside in the garden, and it was fantastic because there's a lot of birds around. Apart from seagulls, the ubiquitous seagulls, there's actually loads of birds around where I live. And the birds all started joining in with the bird song in the Shetland Sounds. It was gorgeous, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess they were kind of going, well, I don't recognise the accent.
Yeah.
You know,
Scottish
who are these
accent.
guys? There's Scots around here, what's going on?
So that's where we're going to have the Inner Shetland Landscape transfers to the new gallery, which we are calling In Camera. That's the name of this specific little gallery at the back of the Ceramic House. So we're bringing the Inner Shetland Landscape to the In Camera gallery and it opens on Friday. But we'll remind you about that at the end.
There's leaflets and everything here.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just ask, can I ask, could you say again where on the Shetlands you work?
Scalloway. So the residency is called Scalloway Booth, and it's run by WASPs. So WASPs run at studios, and they're based in Glasgow.
So, on to the residency. So that brings us kind of up to date. That's where these guys come in. This was the photograph taken by Manel in the studio about a couple of weeks ago. And how should we kind of talk about the kind of process of how we invited the people? Basically, these two pairs of artists who I'll introduce to you now. This is Mike Blow, who works in sound. I'll get Mike to talk about his practice a little bit more in a minute. This is Iris Garolds, who also works in sound. This is Anna Luca, ceramics, and Ingeborg Gudmundsdottir, who also works in ceramics. So we've put a kind of dividing line here. There's sound people on that side.
Ceramics on this side, We had to swap earlier on so that we could keep it even, didn't we, Mike?
But, I mean, there was an interesting thing of how we then brought, two sets of artists together to actually work, people who'd never met each other before, so we had our task, I guess, as curators, on this, if you like, was to find compatible practices, people that we thought we could put together and create something. And my particular interest out of this was the way that our collaboration developed was very much kind of like, I've described it as sort of parallel lines leading to the same destination. We worked alongside each other. We walked the landscape every day, we both collected things, but we didn't actually commingle, if you like. What we did was
until we got to the gallery space.
It was a bit like, going back to the John Cage reference, John Cage and his partner, Merce Cunningham, the choreographer, used to work together to create performances. John Cage would compose soundtracks for Cunningham's work, and often they wouldn't meet, if you like, until the opening night. The dancers would rehearse in silence, or they would rehearse to something else. They rehearsed to a count, to a metronome, and Cage would compose in his studio, and only on the first night would the two elements be brought together. And in a way, that's kind of what happened with us in the gallery space.
Yeah.
We worked alongside each other in dialogue, obviously, about what we're doing. We knew exactly what the other was doing, but actually we didn't know how the pieces were going to come together in a single space until we put them there. And I guess that's still an evolving process as well. So I was really interested with this project, with bringing together other pairs of sound and ceramic artists to explore different ways of collaborating with these two very distinct mediums. And Mike's practice is very much about sort of interactive sound and object-based things. Yours is kind of a little bit more similar to mine in that you use field recordings, but you also use your voice sometimes. There's kind of musicality to what you do as well. And there's lots of other kind of elements to the work. So then it was trying to then figure out how to pair these people together. And the first time they met was on Skype, about a month before the residency started.
So the way we started off to select the artists was, I said it has to start with the ceramics, because the ceramics is what takes the time. And initially we thought we would have, it would be the ceramic artist leading. That's what we said to you, wasn't it? And actually that has kind of changed a bit, I think. It's evolved while you've all been here. But I met both of, well, I met Ingeborg, but I met both of your work at the same time when I was involved in a biennial in Denmark on the island of Bornholm. And I met Ingeborg there, who was representing Iceland, and I saw Anna's degree show. And so I was familiar with their work and invited you both to participate, and then subsequently we tried to think of who to match them up with.
Yeah, and then the process came of, well, which sound artists could they possibly work with? So there we are. I mean, that's kind of how we got to it, and then they met obviously in person on the first day. The residency, practically it's been a month long. We're right near the end of it now. The show actually opens on Thursday, so the artists are actually in the process of installing and putting work in the South Gallery space at the moment. And yeah, I mean, it's been a kind of really interesting process. So the rest of what we're going to talk about now is very much about just a sort of panel discussion between all of these guys here about how they found the whole process of working together and what they've got out of it, and what the challenges are of bringing such two different disciplines together to try and create a joint collaborative piece of work. So, shall we start with Anna and Mike? So do you want to just start by Mike, maybe just say a little bit about your practice, your background, and whether, I don't know, just any thoughts on sort of collaboration, just initial thoughts.
Okay, so my background is originally electronic engineering, then artificial intelligence, then sound art, and all the time I was playing music in bands and things like that. And so I have this kind of rather strange trajectory of engineering stroke science and artistic practice, I suppose, creative practice. And I think I'm interested in, I mean, Joe said earlier on, putting things together to make something interesting, talking about this, the sounds and the ceramics. And quite a lot of the stuff that I've made recently plays with the idea of creating something new, creating something greater than the sum of its parts, basically. That's what I'm interested in. What is that extra kind of added value that gets created when you put two disparate things together? And I find that really interesting, I find it fascinating. And I think this residency is a really great opportunity to explore that idea, basically. So, and it's been really interesting working with Anna. My only regret is I haven't been able to be here as much as I would have liked to be because of distance and because of family and stuff. But we've got some really, one thing I was keen to do was really to embed the sounds within the ceramics, and we experimented with that pretty much the first visit, didn't we? And we ended up with this idea of embedding tiny speakers within the ceramics.
And this was always part of it. I mean, say one of the big reasons that I wanted Mike to be part of this was because I knew he had skills in that area, and I really wanted to see what happens when you start to put sound inside a sculpture, and how that changes the meaning and the context and everything else about the work.
I think it's very important because you need to feel like the object is unified. It's an object that consists of ceramic and sound, not a ceramic bit and a sound bit. You see what I mean? And so if the two are they have a kind of proximity, then that really helps you imagine them or understand them as a unified object. So yeah, and that's looking really great, isn't it? So quite excited about that. Yeah, I think that's.
Anna?
Yeah. So my background is the Royal Danish Academy of Design and Art. But before that, I was a potter. I worked as a potter, not trained. I just kind of worked. I met a woman who did pottery, and she kind of took me under her wing, and then I learned all the technical skills of a potter, and I'm really happy with that. I also, since I was a kid, I draw, made illustrations, and I painted and did all these things. And I kind of today my practice is about taking the illustrative process into the ceramics and making it 3D, so that it's not only a flat surface, but something you can actually walk around or interact with. And one thing I always wanted to do was, because my work is all about creating sort of unworldly worlds, like another universe or another world, like a world of fantasy that you kind of engage with, and it makes your own imagination run, and you can interpret the piece in different ways. But I was always interested in making it even more enhanced than just looking at my object. And this is what we're doing. We're enhancing the object to go further into the room and further into the person actually interacting with it. So I'm really happy I got a chance to do that. Before I got here, I wasn't even aware that was what was going to happen, that I would have that opportunity. I just kind of came, and then I thought, well, we'll see what happens, because I hadn't met Mike, and I didn't really know what to expect. But then I realized that this thing that I always wanted to do is kind of, I'm doing that now.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, because it is like, yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit about the technical challenges? We have had, it's ceramics we're talking about here, and you expect disasters when you're working with ceramics, as I've learned to come to learn with these things, and Anne had a particular.
Well, actually, the stuff I make, this doesn't really show it that good, but I made really complex figurative stuff, and I'm really concentrated and use a lot of skill. And normally it doesn't go wrong. But this time everything that possibly could go wrong kind of went wrong. Yeah. So this sculpture you see in this picture is the Pan God. The project is all about him, but I won't say that much because this is for the exhibition. But he's dead now, he's collapsed.
He is no more.
He lived for a very short while. So I'm actually making another piece now. Yeah, and the technical part was that you also used it. We used some clay that is somehow very sensitive and difficult to work with. Yeah. And I hadn't worked with that before. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
But you don't know until you try the clay.
Yeah, because clay isn't just clay. Clay is alive and has its own will and has a memory, and so you've got to work with it. Yeah.
Can I show where you've got to today? Is that okay?
Yeah.
This is the new piece.
Yeah. This is the almost finished new piece. So it got from being a 3D sculpture to being a wall piece, because I didn't have time to make a new sculpture. This happened when I had 2 weeks left, or maybe a little bit less.
So that's taken the last 2 weeks, basically.
Yeah.
That piece of work was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Pushing the material to the limit, really.
Yeah.
Putting it into the kiln before you really normally would.
Yeah.
But what I really like about this, and do you want to explain about how the sound's going to work with this? Is that,
Can I just, before you go to that, I just
Yeah.
want to say one thing.
Sure.
The good thing about disasters sometimes is that something new happens from these disasters, if you can like turn it around and look at it in a positive way. And I'm actually glad it ended up with this, because we had something about the space and the hallway, and it was difficult fitting this 3D sculpture in such a small place. So I'm actually so happy with this, because I think it's going to be much better fitting the space, and so yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about how the sound's going to work, technically? And then I've got a snippet of one of the sound files as well.
Well, I think the thing, obviously Anna's work is very figurative, and so that in general means that I think you need kind of figurative sounds to bring meanings out of the ceramic piece, or to interact with it. And so I was looking for quotes about Pan, and what I found was interesting was that most of them were from basically late Victorian times, and there was this fascination with kind of Greek Roman mythology during that time, and then more or less at the end of the Great War, really, or kind of hanging on a bit into the 20s, but that was kind of a watershed, and the Jazz Age and modernity took over, and all these old gods, all these classical gods were kind of forgotten. And I found that really interesting, because all the quotes were from around that era, from basically the first 10, 15 years of the 20th century. And so we recorded some of those, and some of those are, I said, from books and poems, and by people like Eleanor Fargen. And we recorded some of those, and we're going to play them out of ceramic flowers with tiny speakers in them. So you better pick those up and hear these quotes. But Joe very kindly recorded them for me in his best theatrical voice.
I'm just going to play you one of them.
Master of bright streams, Lord of green woodlands, King of sun-spread plains and star-splashed hills and valleys drenched in moonlight. And I shall see again a dance of dryads and airy shapes of oreads circling free to shy, sweet pipings of fantastic fauns and lustier breathing satyrs. God of nature, thrice hailing thee by name with boisterous lungs, I will thrill thee back from the dead ages thus. Pan! Pan! Oh, Pan, bring back thy reign again upon the earth.
I think there's something interesting about the idea of animal gods and gods of the landscape, and that's something you're really interested in, isn't it?
Can I say something about why or are we not talking about that?
About what?
Why I choose to work with Pan?
No, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so the title of this whole residency is Landscapes Islands. So I started to think about that, and I tend to work with the things that are not visible, but is in the visible, but are more like unseen, but it's more like a feeling of something. And so I grew up on the Danish countryside, and I played in the countryside my whole childhood. And I was convinced that there were like living beings in the countryside, and I was convinced. And I was talking to them, and they just were my friends, like kids are. And I lived on a Danish island for 4 years while I studied. And so I realized that for me, landscapes is all about inner peace and inner imagination, because when I'm in nature, something happens. I get inspired, not only by what I see, but what I feel. So I wanted to bring that out somehow. How do I bring this feeling out of this magic there is in nature and in landscapes? And so I started looking into Celtic mythology because I was coming to England. And then I found Pan, and then I started reading about him, and then I thought, he's the symbol of what I feel when I'm in nature. So that's why.
That's brilliant, thank you. Should we move on to to our second pairing? So Iris Garros, you're a good one to start here. Let's get there's a picture of Inga working in the studio. It's a very different kind of work. Maybe, do you want to start saying this, what your practice is, and a little bit also then about the kind of things that you sort of brought with you, because you kind of came with quite a strong idea about what you wanted to make before you arrived.
Yeah, I was so lucky that Kay sent me an email early in the year, so this has been on my mind the whole year until I came here, and as you said, it was in the beginning like the sound was going to be interactive to the ceramics, so I was already thinking something, but as the invitation was like, because of your formal work as like inspired by your surroundings or like the nature of the island, Iceland, I of course continued with that, and I have been, I've been fascinated by the stones in Iceland in a nice way to say it. Maybe I'm more like crazy about them or something. My mom is like always telling me, oh, more stones into them. And, that's probably just, that will not leave me. That's okay. I'm going to accept that. And then we will think, I started to think about the title, Landscape Islands, and the fact that I was going to Britain, with Great Britain, I think the island is called.
Yeah, actually, I read it's called Great Britain.
Great Britain.
No,
We just call it England.
No, I know the island is called something particular.
Yes, you're right. It
yeah.
is Great Britain, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the island.
Yeah.
We are on the island.
And I wanted to. Iceland and Great Britain are quite different places.
Yeah.
Even though I had never been here, I knew that. And
Do you want to say something about the kind of the geology of where you live and the kind of clay that you use to represent that? So,
And that brought me to the coastline, of course. We both have coastline, so I went for the stone on the coastline where I live. And I live up north in Iceland, in a tiny village. And I've been a ranger in a national park for a few years. And of course I got inspired by that. And the landscape is really about rocks and desert and black sand. And I've been using black sand in my pieces, and also rather raw, unique Icelandic clay, because the island is so young. We don't have so much clay there, so I've used that as well in my work. But also small pebbles or little stones that I put into my work and make them bleed. And because they have quite low temperature, point, melting point, yeah. So they bleed into the into the stone that I use. I actually tried that with the stones collected from the Brighton beach, and they didn't melt.
They're hard, they're old.
That was really, nice to experience. But that was just a one single test piece. So,
Did you see that? Have you started with that?
yeah, it's those that and so it was for like our first Skype meeting. Then I really understood what I was really excited about the sound in the beginning, because that's something that I've always like fancied to
Which I didn't know, by the way. So that was
no, you didn't.
very serendipitous.
Yeah, fancy to work with sound artist or work with sound myself, but my technical skills are not. Or I have thought that I have. At least I haven't. So I was really pleased to be working with the sound artist. And when we had the Skype meeting, it was just, okay, this is going to be really great. I felt like we were really in the same area. We were did a really great job in
Pairing you up.
We both were site specific of them, and I suggested, or like I told them that I would love if you would play my icons or like make them sound, and you were on to that.
Yeah, I would like
Right, so you want to introduce just a bit about your practice first of all, and then just kind of carry on that bit of a thread of the conversation?
Yes, introducing my practice is a bit of a nightmare. Simply because I find it quite hard to put that down on point. It comes from very different directions and it sprawls out into very different directions. But I think sort of the core sensibility that is behind it is one of improvisation and responding. So I come from a musical direction, and I've always improvised using voice. I later on started to use computers to work with voice, and from that on I've really enjoyed working with sound as material and also as a sort of sculptural material that I go into and move around and bend to my wishes. But over time I also worked much more for specific spaces and specific locations and situations. And what was quite interesting for me was to observe you putting up your sculptures, because there is quite a same sort of spacing going on. We put something in place and then observe it for a long time, or I listen to something for a very long time, and then something else happens to it. I think we've got quite a similar sort of sense of timing in this space. That's what we feel today. So when Ingebjörg mentioned that she'd like to work with the sounds of her sculptures, I really liked that. Since I work with objects, I do performances with objects. Just on one with angle lamps, bowing angle lamps. I use stones for in specific spaces. So the idea of stones also appealed to me, because I'm also an avid collector of stones. Yes, so they pile up.
I've got a little short video clip actually. The sound's not great on it, but it's quite nice. Something we put up on the Ceramic House Facebook page.
all the sounds that we used in the installations are sounds produced by resonating the objects. And that was done in different ways. It was partially drumming on them, using Brighton stones, scratching on them, bowing them, and using sculptures on them. So Ingeborg told me a little bit about her ideas before we got started. And I've been sort of mulling over her ideas of this beach as a space, or as a meeting place of different directions of the sky, of the land and the water, which, so you've got the sky up, the water down, and a surface on the land. So for me, there was very much the idea of direction there and a volume. But she'd also talked about wanting to have her sculptures sort of cascade down the wall, which I found really interesting. And then so we started thinking about it more like a mural, a 3D relief. So I put up 4 speakers in the corner, also a frame to with the objects in place. And I'm at the moment in the process of making sort of a sound piece for that space. So I'm listening to how the sounds move around and move with each other and put them together. So for me, that's very much a feeling that you have in the space, or an experience rather than just a conceptual idea.
Can I play one of the sounds? Because you've been blogging and doing things on, putting stuff up on SoundCloud,
Yeah.
so these are just one of the individual recordings that it's picked up.
So when these sounds of the materials have come together with the actual materials and the volume of the objects, when you look at them, that's sort of almost a sense that you can get a much larger sense of the object because you can hear them. So at the same time, seeing is also contributing something to the directional experience, which I'm trying to establish, because the way Ingeborg is putting up the sculptures on the wall. So it's really interesting to see how that sort of mingles together.
I'll just show a picture of how it's looking today.
Yes.
This is kind of how it got, where it got to by the end of today. It's not a finished piece yet, but it's getting there.
Yeah. And it's really nice, we both played the instrument and we both recorded them. And as you can hear sort of the material of the sculptures in the recording, and you can also see the recordings or making the sound on the objects, because the bows have left sort of a white trace. A bow you have to put a resin on to make it work properly, and that resin left sort of a white outline on the sculptures, which I was worried about, and then you said, oh, no, leave them. So now you've got sort of the sound making trace on the object as well. So I thought that was rather lovely how that sort of went hand in hand, and sort of the different ways of working sort of came together.
It has really been like ping-ponging, like it hasn't really been like you responding to my objects. We have been working like on the idea together.
It's so natural.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
The first day it was really good.
So for me, I love working with other artists and I love working with other disciplines. And I'm interested in process and how work becomes what it is. So the opportunity of working with something that I haven't had a clue about and haven't worked with before was really interesting, and that it felt so just natural really how it came together. So it's really absolutely amazing.
Throw that open to everybody then. What, that process of working collaboratively, what are the kind of, I guess, what are the benefits of it? What have we discovered from it, and what are also the pitfalls of, there's some of the practical things about the kind of ownership of the work, that we talked about right at the beginning, about whose work is it? Is it a collaborative piece of work? Could one of the pieces, could the ceramics be sold separately? Could they be exhibited, or do they exist together? All of those kind of questions.
You could do that, but it'll be a different piece.
Yeah.
It will be different.
Yeah.
This piece will just be there, nowhere else.
Yeah.
Or something,
Yeah.
because it's so specific how we put it on the wall.
It wouldn't make sense.
I think not in all spaces. Of course, it might be in some space, but then it has to be rather similar to this one.
Yeah, and you'd work on it and
Yeah.
build it up in a different way, and I'd change the signs around to make that. I think the difficulty is something that I hadn't really thought about at all before, which is that we both need time in the space.
Yeah.
And we both needed a bit by ourselves, or with not a lot of distraction going. And so if I'm there doing my stuff, it's difficult for you, and the other way around. And then if Mike is there, not you, Mike, the other Mike, is hammering away, that's sort of also different, because he's got his job to do and he needs to finish stuff. So all the demands on the time and the space, and trying to figure out how to negotiate that. That's something that I hadn't really considered before. I'm sorry to say.
And Mike and Anna, any kind of thoughts on the sort of final thoughts on the collaborative process?
We haven't been able to have quite so much of a trying things out. Partly because we're not working so much with the process as regards and the material, and partly because of Anna having to restart. But I think what we got really excited about was this idea of embedding the sound. And at the beginning, I made a pitifully poor kind of play tube thing, and we stuck some earbuds in the end of it, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, that's got a kind of a magic to it, listening to this thing. It's there somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely there somewhere.
There it is.
It worked quite well though, didn't it?
Yeah. So this will become a beautiful flower in the hands of Anna. There it is. Yeah. So, I just think that there's something transformative about it that I really like. As Iris, I'm still working on the composition part, so we're going to put it all together tomorrow, aren't we?
Yeah.
See what happens.
It's going to be exciting.
It's going to be very exciting.
And what I so liked about it is everything is so different. I mean, we have 2 people working with sound, 2 people working for 3 people working with sound, and 3 people working with ceramics, and all the works are completely different. I really love that. So you really sort of see the people in there, and how the individuals sort of think about the relationship and work with their own sort of materials or tools, and I find that fascinating.
Okay, any final kind of thoughts about the sort of collaborative process? Would you do it again?
Oh, would I do the residency with you?
Okay, I could.
Or
Shouldn't have asked that question.
I intend to offer residencies again, and in fact, the next one's already
In planning,
it's already organised really. At the moment, it's a ceramic one, but actually, out of this experience of working together with Old Sound, I think it's a really interesting thing, and I would like to continue that. Yes, and so actually, we have already started talking about incorporating a sound element in the next one as well. I'll do this because I'm aware that this is moving away. Sorry.
Do you want to open maybe a little bit? We're getting a bit of
It's a bit hot, isn't it?
It's hot, isn't it?
People be overdressed.
It's been so. I spend a lot of time in my studio on my own, and it's been the opposite. over the last month. It's been great. So I come in sometimes and I don't know who's going to be in there, and it might be all of you. So it's been, well, it's inspiring anyway to work alongside your peers. So I've been working alongside these two amazing ceramic artists who work in completely different ways to me, with different materials and different outcomes. So you always learn. So I've been learning there anyway, but then I've been learning loads about sound, and also just to see how everyone collaborates in a different way. So it's been, I've been really enjoying. I'm really pleased with everything, really, the way it's gone. Yeah. I'm gonna sit back down here now.
I mean, I think we're kind of nearing the end. Really, it's kind of we'd like to invite everybody to the exhibition opening on Thursday here at 6 o'clock. There's also in the main gallery, there's Technology is Not Neutral opening at the same time. So there'll be a joint opening, there'll be lots going on, there'll be performances down this end. I think you've got events and stuff going on.
Gallery tour at 4 p.m. with the artists.
Gallery
if
tour at 4
here
p.m.
early.
Perfect.
It'll be really good.
On Thursday?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's going to be a really good night, and then you're also invited on Friday to the Ceramic House. There's some leaflets here, please come and take one. There's also some leaflets on the table. Come to the Ceramic House on Friday when a much reduced version of Inner Shetland Landscape is going to be displayed at the in-camera space at the Ceramic House, accompanied by performances from sound artist Kathy Lane and Felicity Ford, both of whom do really interesting work, and it's going to be a fab evening. So that's 6 till 9 on Friday as well, and they're both part of Brighton Digital Festival. Do we want to do questions and things?
Well, I was going to say, I think it's very hard. I think if you want to have a break and come, or do questions in a relaxed way and just go and grab another glass of wine or whatever you want to do.
Yes, I'm very happy. I mean, if people would like to ask them specific questions now to the artists, or we can just kind of mingle over drinks afterwards.
Or mingle over drinks, how about that?
And so, what's the...
Any specific questions? No, it's more
No,
of
so we'll
a comfort break and mingling, I think.
Great.
So thank you all very much.